Welcome to Ask SME Anything. Your chance to ask the IT Pro TV subject matter experts questions live. Here's your host, Don Pezet.
All right, everybody, welcome to Ask Me Anything, the IT Pro TV show where you get to ask the questions and we do our best to answer them as we can. We've, usually got a pretty good track record of that thing. So it's kind of a chance for you guys to throw out the questions that don't necessarily come up in our shows when we create our normal content and make sure that you guys get the information you need to be successful in your studies and in your work career. Now, if you're wondering, how do I get to ask those questions? Well, the answer is good old social media. Love it or hate it. It is a great way to communicate with us. So if you have a question that you'd like us to answer live here on the show, be sure to jump over to our Twitter channel. We are at ITProTV, and you can throw on a hashtag AsksMeAnything, and we will make sure to get you the answers you need to be able to, at least figure something out. That's our goal. And to help me with that, because it is a bigger job than one man can handle, I have Mr. Ronnie Wong right here in the office with me. Ronnie, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Don, for having me on the show. As we kind of get started here in this Ask Me Anything, we will combine our skills together to try and do the best that we can as questions come up and answer them.
And, you are welcome to ask any question you want, but keep in mind that Ronnie's field of expertise is really networking, Cisco, and a few other areas. He's a very well-rounded IT individual, which is a good skill set to have. If you ask a question outside of our area of expertise, don't worry. We have plenty of other SMEs who will be on other days, and we can get to those eventually. So don't hold back from throwing the questions out there. So, all right, with the introductions out of the way, I think it's time to jump into it. Ronnie, are you ready for our first question?
I am actually fearful, but yes, I am ready to go as we start to get some questions in.
Sure. All right, so let's dive into the first one. This one came at us from Twitter, and looks like we've got a IP addressing question on this one. And IP address questions are very, very common on like the Network Plus exam, the Cisco CCNA. A lot of times they throw out tricky numbers to try and get us, and that's probably what we're dealing with here. So the question is 192.168.8.255 and 192.168.9.0/23 valid host IP addresses? So are they valid host IP addresses? I don't know, Ronnie, what do you think?
Well, the answer to this is yes. They are valid IP addresses on network, but it doesn't seem as obvious as the answer. And the reason why is that 0 and that 255, they always throw us because we're kind of told when we first begin to learn about IP addressing, especially about networks, right, that the 0 is usually going to be our network ID, and then the 255 is going to be a broadcast ID. And those are, of course, IP addresses that are not valid host addresses on any network. So when we see something like this, we might automatically go, well, that's a 0, that's a 255, and that has to mean that they aren't going to be valid IP addresses. But what we also have to pay attention to, of course, is the other part in networking, is that subnet mask, which tells us the range of IP addresses that we have in that entire network. So here on this particular question that we have available to us, it didn't give us the standard /24, which is normally going to be a 24-bit subnet mask. And if you've been doing any networking at all, you know that means 254 hosts per network is what we're talking about. But this one kind of did a /23. And if we do that one, as you start to learn more and more about it, that gives us 512 possibilities in that network range, and you take away, once again, the network ID address, one number, and then the broadcast from that entire range. And when you do something like this, you'll end up finding out that if they've done the networking correctly, what I'm assuming, at least what the question seems to be indicating here, is that the network itself begins at 192.168.8.0 and goes all the way through 192.168.9.255. And so right smack dab in the middle, when we get a 0 and a 255, you might go, well, is that still valid? I can see why that would be a question. And Don, I believe that sometimes even some of the end devices may not allow you to address valid IP addresses on machines as a .0 or a .255, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah, I know several operating systems as recently as Windows XP. I'm not sure if Windows 7 does this, but Windows XP would not let you end an address in 0, or you couldn't end an address in 255, even when it was valid. And what I blame is the way a lot of us learn. A lot of us learn kind of messing around at home, hobby style, and at home you usually use a Class C, a /24 network. So yeah, the .0 address and the .255 address, they're not valid. You can't use them. And that's why they put questions like these on the exam, is to test whether your knowledge extends beyond just a typical home network. Because if you think about it, right, a Class A network, let's take the 10.0.0.0/8. So anything that starts with 10 dot is in this network. So I can have 10.1.0.0, that's valid. I can have 10.1.255.255, that's valid. All of these are examples of networks that fall kind of in the middle. Cisco, for the longest time, and it's not like this on the newest routers, but for the longest time, they wouldn't allow you to do it either. Not because they didn't support it, but because they knew other people didn't. And so they didn't want to break other people, they wanted compatibility. And so you used to have to put in a command. It was IP subnet dash 0.
Yep.
And if you did IP subnet 0, that would tell it, hey, it's okay to have an address that ends in .0 or an address that ends in .255. And we've seen equipment change over the time. But yep. So Ronnie, the short answer to the question is yes.
Yes.
Yes, those are valid, right?
Yeah, and it takes a little bit of time, but this is something that we're going to all have to get used to, especially if you're dealing in Cisco and getting your Cisco certifications. They love these types of questions, not only because it proves that you have the basic knowledge down, but it's because you're learning subnetting as well, and they want to make sure that you understand all the concepts behind that. So this question helps us to validate that too, because this is a way that if you're just beginning, you can then do your own binary ANDing and prove that it is actually going to give you a valid IP address right in the middle to do so. So if you're just starting out, remember, go back and take a look at the idea of that binary ANDing that you learned about something in usually in Network Plus. I'm trying to remember exactly
Yeah.
where learned about that, and verify that it is actually going to give you one of those addresses that's not going to end in all zeros in the host bit and not in all ones in the host bits as well. I was trying to remember the right order, but
Yeah.
that's exactly right.
All right, and that's all covered in our Network
Right.
Plus training, but it's also covered in CCNA and a few
Sure.
other areas. So now I mentioned Cisco, and that's going to be a good transition for us into our next question. This one is a Cisco router question. It is, how can I create a certificate to use on a Cisco router or switch without the crypto feature in the iOS? So, the iOS is the operating system found in Cisco routers. This one does not have the crypto feature set. So how do we create a certificate for that one, Ronnie?
Well, as we take a look at the feature set itself, when we need to create a certificate, it's because we got the right iOS that normally ends in K9, and that gives us that ability to generate an RSA certificate and a link that we actually want to generate. That then, of course, we can encrypt everything that we need to. But normally, when you don't have that, probably one of two things has happened. Either as you purchase that router switch, you forgot to mention that you needed that set, and now you're saying, well, how do I get it back? I don't know if you actually can if you just ended up not purchasing the right one. Or you happen to be outside of the United States, and you're in one of these unusual, I shouldn't say unusual, you're in one of these other countries in which now as we cross borders, the United States says, look, we don't allow for an encryption set that's above, I think we said 40 or 48
40
bits,
bits,
to cross the borders, and now you can't get those keys. So what can you do? In that instance, I don't think that we can actually say make it generate one,
Right.
is what we can't do. And Don, I don't believe that I can actually get a third-party certificate authority to issue a certificate to a Cisco router and make it work.
Well, you could, it just wouldn't work, right? So this is where technology and government clash, right?
Right.
So the U.S. government says that U.S. companies are not allowed to export encryption technologies beyond a certain amount, and I believe it is 40 bits. And so you'll frequently find Cisco routers that are being sold that don't have the encryption feature set. And you mentioned the K9.
Right.
If you look at the file name for your iOS, if it ends in K8 or K9, both of those have the encryption features in them. And what the government is really saying is like, hey, if you're doing a VPN, a virtual private network, and you're transmitting data, that it can't be encrypted that hard because our spies need to be able to,
Right.
to read it, right? It's important. But those certificates get used for a lot more than just VPNs, right, Ronnie? And that's probably where this question is really coming from. Is like, hey, if I'm not using the VPNs, how do I do it for the other services?
Yeah, so if you're doing this on a Cisco router, it doesn't really seem like that you can. So you might have to go outside of the realm of Cisco to depend on other equipment to do so if you're going to do something like this. So Cisco in itself, if that's what's happening, yeah, you're probably going to need to find a feature set that's actually going to be
Right.
where you're going to have that.
Yeah, on a normal iOS that has the feature set, you could generate a certificate by saying crypto key RSA gen, and generate one that way. Or just if you turn on
HTTP, yeah.
SSH, or no, wait, it's not SSH that triggers it. It's if you turn on the secure web server,
Secure
right?
web server, yep.
What is that command? IP
IP
HTTP secure dash server.
Secure dash server. Yeah.
There we go. And that'll trigger. It'll generate a self-signed certificate, which is better than nothing,
Right.
right? But when you've got a router that doesn't have that feature set, the IP HTTP secure dash server command isn't even there, and the crypto command
Right,
isn't
isn't there.
even there. So you don't have the commands to issue them. If you were to generate a certificate somewhere else and copy it to the router, just SCP it over, whatever. Ronnie and I were
Right.
working on SCP earlier this week. You copy it over that way. It still won't matter because you won't have a way to load the certificate and it won't work. So there just isn't a good way to do that. And it's because of some of the legal restrictions on those routers.
Yeah, it's kind of neat at the same time to think about this because I remember questions. I like, well, what if we can't afford to buy the one with the feature set? Well, that is kind of the big reason a lot of times. Or like we said, you're in one of those countries that's outside of that agreement, and it's ironic as we talk about it. We have people that are good policy experts here, and they could probably name what that actual technical agreement actually is. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, I could Google it. I know that it's like a treaty or something that's
Yeah.
changed over time. But anyhow, all right. Well, let's continue on our Cisco journey. And just a quick reminder to everybody out there in TV land: if you have a question and want to ask, be sure to reach out to us on our Twitter channel or in our chat room on the IT Pro TV site. If you are on Twitter, use hashtag AsksMeAnything. That's what we're watching and seeing questions come up, like this next question about default routers. So basically, this question is asking a pretty straightforward question here. When should I set a default route versus using the IP default gateway command on, it doesn't say it, but I would assume on a Cisco router because that is a Cisco command,
Right.
IP default gateway.
Yeah, that's actually kind of a neat question. And what gave away, like, why are we talking about just Cisco routers here, is that the very end versus the IP default gateway. Well, that's a real Cisco command, and so that's what we're assuming at this point, is that we're referring to Cisco routers. So when we need to communicate with devices off of our own network, right, we need some path that gets us, well, from wherever we are, a way out. So normally we would set some type of default gateway on our devices. My laptop has a default gateway. Don's laptop has a default gateway, so that when my computer needs to send anything off of the network, it knows exactly where to send it to. So in that sense, we have a default gateway set up. Now in Cisco, when you do something like that, you're using what we call IP default gateway, and that essentially sets up a default gateway on individual networking devices or Cisco devices inside of our network so that they can find a path outside of our network when they need to. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering, like, why would I ever do something like this? Well, let's take for an example that you want to do some router or switch management inside of your network. Well, all you have to do, of course, is run SSH. You can connect into it as long as you're within inside the network. But what if you're managing this from another network? Well, if you're managing this from another network, then that means when you connect in using SSH, then the return traffic has to also be able to send it back out to where you are on that other network. So that's where the IP default gateway would come into play, where you would have that on the individual devices inside of your network. Now, on the idea of the default route, if we were to set up an IP route to configure a static default route, well, that is kind of a catch-all for us that we normally set up on the router that leads where we want it to go. And we're saying that if there is some network that the devices inside of my network is not listed in the routing table of where to go, then we set up a static default route that allows us to go ahead and say, if it comes here and it doesn't match anything in the routing table, then go ahead and forward it on to that IP address, or even another way to configure it, of course, is to do this with the exiting interface. In other words, forward it on to this interface that it's going to pass out through. So in this configuration, even though the question says versus, well, if you're just doing the idea of where you should set, or not where, when should you set one up, one would be on that router that's leading out of our network, and then on the IP default gateway, it's probably on the individual networking devices within. But in general, you probably want to set up both, is what you
Yeah,
want to do.
the key differentiator that I use on these is that the IP default dash gateway command, that just helps that device. So if it's a switch, if it's a router and use IP default gateway, that switch or that router can now access other networks. But the default route, that affects the traffic flowing through the device. Well, if it's a layer 3 device, right? A switch isn't going to use it unless it's a layer 3 device there. So, but on a router, you typically set both, so you can have your remote management and be in good shape there. So it's not so much of one or the other. On a layer 2 device, or a device that doesn't participate in routing, you would just be setting the IP default dash gateway. All right, and Ronnie, while you were explaining that, you did a great job. I managed to look up the name of that treaty.
Yes.
This is a mouthful right here.
All right.
It's all wrapped up under the Encryption and Export Administration Regulations, which they abbreviate as EAR. And here's the best part, Ronnie, because it was updated in 2017.
Well, there you go.
It is the Wassenaar Arrangement 2016 Plenary Agreements Implementation.
Wassenaar arrangement.
Yeah, they need a public relations team to come up with better names for this stuff. But anyhow, the new rule is 56 bits.
56.
So anything 56 bits or above is not allowed to be exported, and that's where you're going to see a lot of these routers that don't have the feature set. SSH version 2, which is what we want to default to for management, I believe it's 64 bits, isn't it?
Yes.
If I recall correctly. So just SSH version 2 would already push us over that limit. And with SSL, those, I believe, default to 128-bit now with the newer TLS standard that you're supposed to be using. So both of those are well over that limit. All right. Well, let us move over to our next one. And Ronnie, this is another one that's coming at us from our Twitter feed via hashtag AsksMeAnything. And it is right back in that wonderful world of subnetting, right? Because subnetting is difficult, it's challenging, so don't feel bad about asking questions about these. It is hard to learn. The question we've got today is, what is the exact difference between CIDR and VLSM? CIDR is CIDR. It's kind of the same, right?
That's actually a great question. Most people do get this confused. Once again, it comes down to how people end up using it in your network. So if you've been working with other networking professionals inside of your network, you'll probably hear people address like your own network or somebody else's subnet as, the 16/24 network or whatever it might be. And they're using CIDR notation just in their daily talking, in the way that they're describing the networks that they use. So when we talk about variable link subnet masking, VLSM, well, what is that about then? Because you also see people addressing and network diagrams that have different subnets that are represented, also with the CIDR notation. But when somebody hands you that, they're saying, oh, yeah, this is variably subnetted here. And they hand you that, and now you're going, wait a minute. So CIDR and VLSM, they kind of sound exactly the same. So why is there a differentiation? So that is a great question here. But when it comes down to it, the idea of CIDR technically is where the ISPs get involved. They're handed a particular number of publicly available IP addresses from a block, and they're told, here's what the number of subnet bits that you're going to have. And so they don't go through and do the subnet mask. They just say the first 32 bits, or that would be kind of silly, the first 27 bits, or the first 16 bits of this network is going to be your network portion that you'll be able to be in charge of. Well, then if you end up going to the ISP and you lease an address, or you purchase one from the ICANN or IANA, I don't know exactly which organization it is, but when you purchase,
usually ARIN, right?
Aaron, yeah. So if you purchase one, well, they go ahead and give you your block and whatever that might be. Let's say it's 16 addresses. Well, in theory, then you can take that and chop it up the way that you need to internally, if you wanted to divide that up as well. So the way that I always thought about it is that there's a good analogy that I think about here is that or that I read about, is that CIDR is sort of like the big juicy steak that you order at the restaurant. And you order that big old 32-ounce porterhouse steak like Don does every Friday night, and and then Don can variably cut it up to the size and pieces that he wants to, and that's variable length subnet masking. So I like that analogy because it works. It essentially says, well, here's the way that your ISPs assign this block, and then you can take whatever you're given from that, and then you can chop it up the way that you need to. So when we talk technically about variable length subnet mask, that's when we use, well, different subnet masks within our own networks to make sure that we're not wasting the addresses that we have as well. And that's because there was a big problem before all this began, which was the classful addressing, and that's why we started doing the CIDR and the VLSM.
You know, where I've found a lot of the confusion comes in is that if you're using VLSM, you're using CIDR. You know,
Right.
like you have to. VLSM has to be used in conjunction with CIDR, but the reverse is not true.
Right.
You can use CIDR without VLSM. So with CIDR, all you're saying is because in the olden days when we had classful routing, all you had to do was see the first octet of an IP address, and based on that number, you knew if it was a Class A, a Class B, or a Class C. And let me see if I can remember
Right.
here. I'll dust off my knowledge. If it was 1 through 120, was it 126?
127 technically.
Were Class
Yeah,
A's. And then you had 128 all the way up to 191 were Class Bs, and 192 all the way through 239 were Class Cs. So you just had to know that first number. Well, with CIDR, we said that first number doesn't matter anymore. That if it starts with a 10, it could be a Class A, it could be a Class B, it could be a Class C.
Right.
It'll still be a class though. It'll still be, you know, one of those, but the first number doesn't dictate what class it is. So that's when we started using subnet masks, because in the early days you didn't have subnet masks because the first number determined it. But with VLSM, you never know. Like, the first number doesn't matter at all with VLSM. So you're technically always using CIDR when you use VLSM, and that's where a lot of people get mixed up
Yeah.
and think they're the same thing because you're being forced to use them together. So.
Yeah,
Yep.
Don, that makes a great point. Sometimes historically, you kind of lose that understanding of why it happened the way it did, and it's because of where you come in networking. If you first started out where you were still doing a little bit of classful, and then you changed over, it probably makes a bit more sense. But if you're jumping into it like now, right? It's May of 2018 at this point, and we're about to hit the realm of IPv6. The idea of why this is the way it is doesn't really make as much sense anymore. And we probably don't get a lot of the historical background like we used to as well, even in our teaching today.
Yeah. Yep. And some people always wonder, like, why do I need to learn the old stuff? But in this case, knowing a little bit of history on it helps you to separate it out and understand what it is. All right. Well, Ronnie, let us move to what will probably be our last question of the show. This is another one coming at us from our Twitter feed using hashtag AsksMeAnything. Remember, anybody can throw a question in. I did say this is probably going to be our last question of the show. If we didn't get to your question, don't worry. We do continually do this show. Right. We'll get to it in another episode, or we can always reach out to you via our forums or other means of communications. So definitely throw those questions in there. But this one is talking about the certification. So as someone who's studying for the CCNA, they said, I want to earn the CCNA. I already have Network Plus. Do I need to do the CCENT exam? So what are your thoughts on that one, Ronnie?
That is a great question, because I've seen this question, or people have asked me this personally. I really have a good foundational grasp on networking. So can I just jump in and go ahead and do the CCNA exam? Well, when it comes down to it, you have a certification path, right? For the CCNA routing and switching, you can take a 1-exam path, okay? Or you can take a 2-exam path, and that includes that CCENT or CCENT, and then, of course, a CCNA exam for routing and switching.
And Ronnie, I've got the Cisco site pulled up on my
great.
laptop here so we can see that path. I'm going to just kind of zoom in a little bit here so you can see. This is what Ronnie is talking about, the two different kind of avenues of approach on this one.
Yeah, so with that avenue approach, if you go, hey, I'm really confident that I know enough networking knowledge to be able to do this, you can try and skip and go directly into that single exam. But what you're assuming is that when you get in that single exam, there's no real prerequisite for it, but they're already assuming, or at least the examiners are assuming, that you already have good working knowledge of Cisco equipment. And in Network Plus, if you've just earned it and you're getting your start into networking as well, jumping in that may be a little bit more overwhelming than you think because you might not have had any previous experience with the Cisco equipment itself. And since it's a Cisco exam, it's going to be heavily based on working and making sure that that equipment can work. So traditionally, what I recommend is that even if you have the Network Plus certification under your belt, I would still go for the CCENT exam anyways. You will get a lot of overlap. Don't get me wrong. You'll see that you'll get plenty of overlap. But the nice thing about it is it will introduce you into the command line interface and into the workings of the Cisco routers and switches. And that's what you'll really need to help you prepare for earning your CCNA as well. Okay. So you'll actually take another exam. And the great thing is you'll earn a certification out of it. And then you'll be ready and hopefully continue to pursue towards your CCNA routing and switching with the second exam. And once you do that, you'll end up with your CCNA routing and switching, just as an example. So I like the two-path idea. Even if I had the Network Plus knowledge already, you probably don't have all the Cisco knowledge that you need. And you also probably are not ready for the amount of subnetting so that you'll actually need to very much familiarize yourself with to be able to pass that exam, okay? Either the single one or the double one. And it's kind of a shame when one of the things that really holds a lot of candidates back when they take this exam is the timing of the exam. And it's just a shame if you go, all right, I have my Network Plus. Oh, the reason why I can't get through the exam with a time is because I don't know the Cisco equipment. That would be pretty sad.
Yeah.
So I recommend the 2-exam path.
Let me throw another positive spin on the 2-exam path. There's a few other benefits that you don't necessarily realize offhand. If you've already got some experience, you might look at it and say, hey, this is 1 exam versus 2 exams, right? Maybe I can do the 1 exam and save some money. Well, the 1 exam, they call it the composite exam. The composite exam actually costs twice as much as the normal exams. So you end up paying the same amount of money. So money-wise, it makes no difference whether you do 2 exams or 1. The other thing is the difficulty level. The 1 exam features mostly questions that are pulled from the second exam, from the 2 path. So the harder questions, right? But you're supposed to already know that knowledge, right? So really, you're not making life any easier on you. All you're doing is saving time. The exams are 90 minutes each. So if I do 1 exam, it's 90 minutes. If I do 2 exams, it's 180 minutes. Now, if time is of the utmost importance to me and I can't spare any, then there's some value there. But otherwise, you're better off taking the 2 exams, especially if you're brand new to Cisco, right? Let's go worst case scenario. If you go in and you take the CCENT exam and you don't pass, well, it costs you just the price of that 1 exam and you can retake it, and that's that. If you do pass CCENT and then you take the CCNA exam and you don't pass, well, you have your CCENT certification. You got something for that first exam, you put it on your resume, and now you can go out and find that job. If you take the composite exam and you don't pass,
Nothing.
you get nothing. Yeah, and you're out the money for both exams, basically. So there's a higher risk level. So literally the only benefit of doing that composite exam is to save time, right? Any other scenario, you're better off doing the 2 different exams. You can schedule them back to back if you want. You know,
Right.
Cisco doesn't care. You can even take them backwards. I did that once, where I took the second exam first. Not on purpose. It was a scheduling mix-up. But anyhow, so you can certainly do that. Ultimately, it's your choice. But if you want to be awarded the CCNA, you either have to do the 100-105 and 200-105 exams, or you have to do the 200-125 exam, which is the composite exam. You've got to do one or the other. You can't just skip an exam without showing that you've learned that material. All right, Ronnie. Well, I think that is all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank you for joining us here in my office.
Well, thank you. And thank everybody for the questions that we had as well. They were a little bit challenging as I'm trying to remember all the stuff that I think that you're going to throw at me. And I'm glad that they were relatively easy today.
All right, and I do want to remind everybody, if we didn't get to your question here on the show, please don't give up hope on us. We will try and get you the answers that you need. We want you to be successful in your studies, but you're also welcome to join us for Asks Me Anything, which is regularly occurring here on IT Pro TV. Keep an eye on our Twitter feed. In fact, if you follow our Twitter feed, you'll see the questions that get thrown out there and responses, not just from us, but from people like you out there in the community. So definitely keep an eye out for it. I appreciate you all watching and hope you'll join us again on Asks Me Anything.